to all of you, and welcome to day 2 of our conference. Today, we have two distinguished guests and two plenary lectures. We begin with the plenary lecture 2, Rivers in Transition, Reconciling Development with Biodiversity Conservation in India, delivered by Dr. Aashna Sharma, Fulbright-Kalam Climate Post-doctoral Fellow at the University of Washington. To formally introduce Dr. Sharma, I invite Dr. Sandeep Majumdar, Assistant Professor, Department of Conservation Biology, Durgapur Government College. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya. A very good morning to all. It is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Aashna Sharma, speaker of today's first plenary lecture. Dr. Aashna Sharma is a distinguished freshwater ecologist and conservation scientist whose work bridges the realm of science, policy, and public engagement to protect aquatic biodiversity. She is a Fulbright-Kalam postdoctoral fellow at the University of Washington, Seattle, and an awardee of the prestigious Alexander von Humboldt Postdoctoral Fellowship, reflecting her commitment to advancing ecological research on a global scale. With a PhD from Punjab University, conducted in collaboration with the Wildlife Institute of India, she has spent nearly a decade immersed in fieldwork across Himalayan river systems, investigating the ecological impacts of climate change and invasive species, particularly on native fish populations such as snow trout. Her current research focuses on India's freshwater megafauna, which are often overlooked in conservation policies. Using text mining and synthesis science, she aims to identify gaps in research and policy, ensuring that conservation efforts are data driven and impactful. She has been an invited speaker at Fulbright Talk 2025, modeled after TED Talks, where she shared insights on freshwater conservation and was awarded the Fulbright Outreach Lecturing Fund award, enabling her to translate scientific knowledge into actionable strategies for students and educators across the United States, including at the University of Texas in Austin. Dr. Sharma's expertise extends beyond academic research. She has worked extensively on climate change adaptation, species conservation, and ecological modeling, contributing to the assessment of environmental impacts on various taxa in low-tech ecosystems. Her work has been instrumental in developing predictive models for Himalayan fish species, assessing native invasive interactions, and identifying conservation hotspots for freshwater biodiversity. She has also served as a senior project associate at the Wildlife Institute of India, where she played a key role in evaluating climate change impacts on aquatic ecosystems. Dr. Sharma is deeply passionate about harmonizing development with conservation, advocating for science that empowers both ecosystems and the communities that depends on them. Her dedication to public engagement and science communication ensures that her research reaches beyond academia, influencing policy and fostering a deeper understanding of freshwater conservation. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Sharma, a visionary conservationist whose work is shaping the future of freshwater conservation in India and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Aashna Sharma to deliver her plenary lecture at the International Conference on Living in Harmony, Celebrating Biodiversity for a Sustainable Future. Over to you, Dr. Sharma.
Thank you, Dr. Majumdar, and thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya. It's indeed a pleasure to be part of this international conference. I would say that this has come in at the right time because we are speaking of living in harmony, and living in harmony is quite not possible given the fact that the world has already entered the sixth mass extinction, as to say, and thereby it's the right time to be organizing this. And for that, I would like to thank the coordinator and head, Department of Conservation Biology, Durgapur Government College, and also for having me here. Specifically, I would like to thank Dr. Bhattacharya because it's been long and I'm really glad to meet you, although virtually. Before I begin, I would love to share my screen so that everybody can have a look at what I'm presenting. So give me a minute, please. Just to confirm, is this visible?
Yes, it is visible, Aashna.
Okay, perfect. So as we begin, I would wish to say that in the recent past, I've been speaking with many people here in the US and taking bits of my experiences that I've had from India. And I must say that the introduction which was given for me, I don't deserve that extensive introduction. I'm still learning and learning from good stalwarts like yourselves. But what I've understood is that I'm humbled to be representing our country here, and people at times do not realize the fact that our country is doing the level best in terms of managing conservation and development equally. That's quite not possible for anybody in the West to understand. But today I would wish to present forth you why India is one of the nations which is actually living in harmony. And the reasons are very interesting. So let me take you across and walk you through on how we are reconciling the biodiversity conservation with the development. Well, the last week of April 2023 was when I was planning my transition from the Wildlife Institute of India to University of Washington, Seattle. And I was really excited about my project here, where I had to work on the freshwater megafauna of my country, and I was planning to build climate change and species distribution models for the same. But this was also the time when I heard the news that India has surpassed China in terms of being the highest populated nation. Now, this comes as a double trouble for us. First, we are developing, we are still not developed. As such, we need more developmental activities, we need more energy, which might not be totally green. And then we also need to conserve these enigmatic and charismatic fauna that the world never speaks of. So, as a conservation biologist and a wildlife researcher, I thought this is interesting challenge. And how do we cope with this? Well, the first thing is that conservation versus development, the story is not quite the same in the West as it is in the East, so to say. And science in India is not just driven, uh, the conservation is not just driven by science as such. We do have the modern technology, we do have the artificial intelligence coming in, the wildlife research, we do have automated imagery analysis from camera trapping right onto drone surveys, but we also have our conservation deeply rooted in spirituality. And it's interesting when I went through my mom's dissertation, which she did in a master's time, and I realized she had worked on all the animals which the deities in India prefer as their vehicles. And this came as an interesting idea where I understood even deities do not differentiate and they do revere the wildlife much more than we do as humans across the globe. But this is one of the reasons why we are very much rooted in terms of conserving our species because we value them. We also end up worshipping them. Now, you might have heard about The Money Heist, right? This is one of the Netflix series. I know I'm not supposed to speak about Netflix on this international platform, but I haven't watched the series, but a friend of mine told me about this. And you know what? Sitting in the state of West Bengal, I think you must know about it because our country has the India's money heist. The Sundarbans fishermen generally are given these masks, which they have been wearing for many, many years. The way these masks are so similar to the money heist is a little modern version of the mask, but people have been wearing this. Now, these are the honey collectors and the fishermen. These people generally go into the forest and venture deep inside to fetch the really, really pure honey, which we have. Before heading into the forest, they pray to the deities, which we have there. And then it's interesting to see how different religions worship the same deities in different form there. And what we realize is that although there are tigers, which are ambush predators in the Sundarbans, These people worship them to a great deal, so much so that the forest department doesn't stop them as is expected otherwise in the other countries to do so. We do not put them down, but rather we pray to them, and then we generally are given incentives. A tiger is allowed 3 human kills before designating it as a man eater, and thereby we have a really, really, really strong reverence towards the species. We give them a chance. We want them to be part of our ecosystems, and we share our ecosystems with them because at times, as I told you, we worship them. After all, they are really, really closely associated with the god. As such, the colonial history of tiger hunting in India long back was not expected to bring our tigers to a deep decline, but again bring them forth via bouncing back really, really strong, which is a very big, strong step taken by our country, which is developing, but is still managing the world's largest populations of these tigers as well as the elephants. We have the highest numbers of elephant corridors, which are mapped. They are also transnational, moving into Nepal. And it's not just about the terrestrial ecosystems, I must say. Most important are the rivers, which we very less speak of. This one of the areas in the Great Himalayan National Park, and that's me. I was trying to cross this bridge, and you know what? As I crossed this bridge and went on the other side of the bridge, this is what I saw. There are trees which are clad with the red cloths, and I wonder to myself, are people worshipping the trees here as gods? And when I talk to the localites, I realize it's not the trees, it's in fact the local deities which are inanimate. They don't have any form. So the nature is worshipped. And the spirit of animism, thus, is really, really strong in our country, which helps us sustain the rivers, the riparian habitats, the buffer areas. The people here do not allow hunting down any animals because the deities here do not allow hunting. As such, the rivers are often worshipped in our country. Examples being River Ganga and Yamuna as well, which have been granted the legal rights of personhood. I understand that the case is still pending, but it's not suspended as yet. So we are hopeful that these rivers, as a few other countries who name their rivers as persons, would end up being getting the status of humans themselves. Um, it's just about the modern times, but since the past, we've worshipped the rivers, and thereby having a strong reverence for them makes us conserve these areas much better. I dug very deep into literature and tried to understand what is the hidden pattern on how we conserve our species in the most populous nation of the globe, but still having most of our best species conserved. Like the Gangetic River dolphin, we have the Ganges shark. And yes, I spoke to a couple of people. Some of them were from India, representing a few colleges back here. And I told them about the Ganges river shark. And they said, "Oh, do we have river sharks in India?" Well, yes, we do. It's just that we don't speak about them. And speaking about them, about them is really, really important for us as conservationists and scientists. Of course, given the fact that we have a leverage of having the background of animism connection, and we know we value them more, and why do we need to conserve them? But adding a scientific input helps a nation to do much better. Now, look at this. This is the golden mahashir, which is one of the species we have in the river Ganges, also called tall putitora. This species is found all across the Himalayan regions, doesn't go anywhere down the peninsular region. Its distribution is strongly related to the orogeny or the mountain upliftment of Himalaya. So it's co-evolved with the area. It looks quite similar this when I looked at the image. The first incarnation of Lord Vishnu was pretty much similar to the all called the Matsya Avatar, was very much similar to the golden mahashir. Of course, this is just a depiction, and the fish might have looked very different. But just look at it. There have been incarnations again which are closely related to freshwaters, again like the Kurm Avatar. As such, the government of India has designated many rivers as heritage, just like UNESCO has. And we have about 75 water heritage sites, which the government declared on the 75th year of independence. And these areas are closely related to the cultural ethics or ethos of the area. I tried to zoom into one of these areas in the state of Himachal Pradesh, and I realized that place was very close to my own hometown. I belong to the state of Himachal Pradesh. And I realized that the fact that why that area was considered to be really important water heritage site, because the pool was worshipped since years, and it is undated till the time that pool has been worshipped. It has properties to heal skin ailments, and there are deities which are believed to be associated with the area. As a case study, just let us look at the Ganga River Basin. We speak about the river Ganges outside here, but Ganga, which is really revered. We have thousands of people depending on the river in terms of the hydroelectric potential that the river has. But also, we have the largest mangrove forest where the river joins the oceans. And we know about one thing for sure, that there are many species which are harbored native to India, native and endemic to the Ganges basin. But there are two big troubles: damming and pollution. And that would happen given the fact that we are still developing. Our country is under development. We need more hydropower, of course, in the name of green energy. It's debatable for sure. As a freshwater biologist, I do have opinions for and against this, but I would say dams are one of the largest assets of our country, but are also one of the largest troubles for the biodiversity. Then comes pollution. Let's look at these problems one by one. We are tackling pollution, so to say. There are many areas across the River Ganga where species like the Royal Bengal tiger, the smooth-coated otter, and also the Gangetic dolphin is being conserved to a great extent. And you know how we do that? Under the Namami Gange project that India started, wherein we have lots of areas which are being cleaned up. So they're ambitious river cleanup projects. We have over 175 STPs, or the sewage treatment plants, which have been sanctioned or are in place already. The ghats have been rejuvenated. And why do I mention about this? Because owing to this, there have been reports of sightings of Gangetic dolphins rising again, which is a positive sign. You see, these megafauna, which I'm currently working on, these species are strong indicators of the health of the ecosystem. The more you see them, they're at the top of the pyramid, of the ecological pyramid, and you know that they're there, that means the rest of the ecosystem is healthy, it's doing well. In fact, the UN ranked Namami Gange of India as one of the top 10 world restoration flagships program. So basically, we are doing pretty well, right? Under the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, we have targets set for our country where we are trying to live in harmony and trying to have both the biodiversity and a sustainable future for the humans as we exist on the planet together. But as I spoke to you about the dams, I definitely need to mention about that. You see the red marks here across the Himalayan region. When I was working across the states, Himalayan states, I realized there are about 100 big dams built across the Himalayan region. And the entire country, of course, has over 5,000 large dams, which comes as a largest threat to the biodiversity because they tend to move across the streams. I'll tell you how. For example, the snow trout, one of my favorite species, because I worked on this for my doctoral dissertation, is native to Himalayan region. It evolved with the orogeny of the mountain, and as the mountains rise, the snow trout did evolve. So it's very closely tied and interlaced to the Himalayan ecosystem. And it is a herbivore species. So it grazes upon the biofilm on the little rocks and pebbles that you see in the streams. So whenever you might get a chance, or you have been to any stream, just remember you might have seen little cobbles, pebbles lying around the rivers. Just pick one of them, and you'll find them to be slimy or slippery. It's actually covered with a layer of biofilm, which is combined algae, bacteria, and definitely they are like the grasslands for these species to graze upon. In fact, I read about it that the the herbivore species actually cut short the height of the biofilm to a particular level so that the sunlight can reach them, and then the biofilm can grow more. So they're like lawn mowers of the entire ecosystem, maintaining their health. But the fish, snow trout, and all its related species are under threat due to stressors like overfishing, damming, and now even climate change, as per the evidences. What we realize is that through the empirical evidences we produced through our project and my work back then, um, the snow trout was supposed to be found in 3 basins across the west and northwestern Himalayan region. So at the top, you see the Tirthan River Basin, the Great Himalayan National Park, the Parvati River Basin, followed by the Tirthan Basin. Both are part of the Great Himalayan National Park. And this is the Asi-Ganga River Basin, downstream of the Gangotri National Park. And I tried to find out where all does the snow trout exist. The black dots here are the points which we sampled across about 4 years. And we knew we have the snow trout here. But eventually, we realized there's some hidden threat besides the ones I've already spoken of, like the climate change, overfishing, pollution, which was wiping out these species from this area. And what was that threat? Perhaps we had never spoken about that. The story started somewhere in the 1860s when a few British people entered the Himalayan landscape and thought that the area is actually a no fish zone because they could not find any fish. Now, here's the catch. The people who went there were British people who brought with them memories of their British times when they angle and they catch fishes through bait fishing or angling. Now, we do have fish in the higher elevations of Himalaya. But as I told you, the snow trout is a herbivore. It would not come in for fly fishing and for caddis flies as their bait. Of course, it was not lured by the insects up there. And thereby, the people, they declared these regions as no fish zones and introduced a species from their region into India, the brown trout. Now, this is where the blunder was done. They did not realize that this species would end up being one of the worst invasive alien species and will topple down the snow trout throughout the region. The reason that I'm speaking about this here is that I see potential in all of you youngsters out there who have aims of becoming conservation biologists, scientists, policymakers. And these are the reasons which we need to keep in mind before we introduce a species. And how do we conserve it now? Since 1860s until 2016, when we started our project back then, nobody knew what's the impact of the invasive brown trout on the native snow trout populations, especially given the fact that the brown trout were preferred because they bring revenue to the region, they bring more livelihood to the people of the region, and they bring development thereby to the region. In fact, the ironical situation is that one of the rivers in the Great Himalayan National Park is still undammed because people told the government not to dam that river because they wanted more tourists to come in and go ahead with the angling practices. The more angling and sport fishing they do, the more revenue these people will get, and the dams were creating a barrier. Indirectly, they ended up conserving the river by favoring the brown trout, but they didn't know that they have the snow trout in the region as well, and the brown trout is creating pressures on them. Now, these 3 watersheds, which I already spoke of, are really interesting in terms of Parvati and Tirthan have both the snow trout and the invasive brown trout. So we have the native and non-native species, but the basin up there, Parvati, also has the dams. So it brings a very interesting combination of comparison. What's the impact of anthropogenic developments on the river basin? And what's the impact of just the invasive species? So we have both the stressors together and one stressor in one place. The third basin was a control basin where we had just the snow trout. The results, trust me, were very, very interesting. Now, this is a spatial stream network model, not to go into complexities, but just a model which was built out of our presence records and our field observations. Where all is the snow trout found? The basin up here is the Asiganga Basin, where you see snow trout occurring in an allopatric association, which means it's occurring alone in the basin. And you see that the snow trout is occurring all across the main stem. The reds are higher probabilities of occurrences, and larger diameters here are indicative of higher confidence. Now, what you see down here is the Tilson Basin. And you see the reds here? It's patchy. The whole population of snow trout is depauperate or broken in structure. And I'll tell you the reason. This is the reason. What you see up here is the distribution in the same basin, Tilson Basin, of the brown trout. And you realize one thing for sure here, that the brown trout has occupied the entire main stem of the region. I go back to the previous slide again and show you that in the absence of brown trout, snow trout does tend to prefer the main stems of the river because those are areas which are really, really beneficial for the snow trout, good nesting sites, warmer areas, but also the flow is optimal and the food preferences are taken care of. But under the influence of the brown trout, the snow trout is being sent off to suboptimal habitats. As such, the population is becoming more disjunct and discontinuous. So there are threats of biological invasions here. The invasive species is pushing the native up to suboptimal areas. And what we can do now in terms of having the species in there already in the system is that designate the high elevation areas as invasion refugia and prioritizing the main stems for restoration. But what happens in the future, even if we restore the main stems and try to catch and maybe harvest rather than catch and release the brown trout back? The future is much more serious for both these species. You see this two overlapping maps that I created for you here. What you see is the distribution of snow trout in the current and the future scenarios. And this condition is really, really a pulsating sense of future for the snow trout. Reds are the areas of high probabilities of occurrence. And you will see in the future, the distribution of the distribution range of the entire across the entire core Himalaya for the snow trout is diminishing. There is a future loss of about 32% in area, and there's a high altitude squeeze. If you have a very keen look at the region, the snow trout is trying to go to higher elevation rivers and moving beyond the main stems, which, as I told you, are higher priority areas for the snow trout in terms of being optimal habitats. As such, there's a range contraction. Now, the theory here is not as simple as it is for the terrestrial species. Just imagine a landscape like this. And if I tell you, if you go by two areas which are really close together, as per the mapping, which generally happens, we follow the Tobler's first law of geography, which is very simple. Imagine the points A and B here. If it is a terrestrial species, for example, the snow leopard or any other high elevation species in the Himalaya, if it is present in point A, there are high probabilities of that species being present in the neighboring pixels, which is point B as well. But the things are not very simple in case of predicting the future or understanding the movement patterns for riverine species. The reason being that rivers are actually dendritic in structure. So they come from different sources. Just imagine now a fish species at the point F, which wants to go up to either of the tributaries. It has to make a choice at a confluence where there are two streams merging. Imagine one of them being rain-fed, which is warmer, and another one being snow-fed, which is cooler. Now, a cold water species would definitely tend to prefer moving towards the left-hand side tributary rather than the right-hand side on your screens. And thereby, prediction modeling and also on-field observations for these species are not that simple and do not follow the laws of typical geography, which normally happens. Because the species in freshwaters, and especially rivers or the low-tech ecosystems, are so much selective in terms of their movement, barriers come as an important parameter to understand the major stresses on them. As I told you, in the future, the warm As the warming happens, the snow trout would tend to move towards higher elevation. But the brown trout already exists there and is already existing with them down there. And then there are dams. So you see, the conditions are not pretty simple for all the cold water fish species and for all the species across the country. If you see this map, which I try to plot the conflict drainages of the snow trout as compared to the brown trout across the Himalaya, you will see the black dots across the region. These black dots are the larger dams which we have across Himalaya, as I initially showed you. This is the Indus River Basin. You have three large dams on the Indus itself, and there are future conflict drainages here as well. You see that currently the snow trout is under conflict in some of the regions. In future, the conflict rises in the eastern Himalaya. Now, the species would tend to move, but the movements are not easy as we have dams all over. And trust me, if I try to plot all the dams, these are just the larger dams, which are about 100 in number. If I try to plot all the dams across Himalaya, you would not have been able to see the predictions. You see, the condition is really grave. And a country like ours, where development is happening, we do demand hydro energy, and we do demand more water for irrigation. And thereby, we need to have dams and barrages. Now, what do? There are areas where dams are being built in the most seismically active zones, especially the Himalayan region. And it is definitely one of the most untapped region of India in terms of the hydropower potential. And the country calls it green energy, but how green it is up to us as conservation biologists to bring out the science there and collaborate with hydrologists to understand, is it good enough to build a dam in these seismically active areas? Although people are protesting and there are certain projects which have been shut down, but we cannot do that forever. Of course, unlike areas like the West, this is the Elva Dam, which is one of the dams in the states I am currently right now in the US, the state of Washington. This was a dam which was long built, and they underwent a deconstruction which initiated in 2011. And the site in the picture at the bottom, what you see is after the dam was removed. I read research papers about what has happened after the dam was removed. And trust me, there are 8 freshwater fish species that have come back and occupied the upstreams of the dam within the first year of the dam removal. It's been hundreds of years that the dams have been there. This dam had been there. It's not that the species take time to come back to their original areas. They know, they have the homing instincts. They just need to come back if the situation is provided to them. And then there are 5 salmon species here, 2 trouts, and one of the crayfishes, which did return back. For India, this cannot be done. We have to wait for at least 10 to 20 years before we start even thinking of undamming. But definitely there are other ways out. We are into collaboration with countries like France and Germany, where we have come into an international solar alliance. So solar power is being tapped in lieu of the freshwater power or the hydropower. What we can do as scientists is talk to policymakers. Maybe we can talk to them about why it is important for us not to dam certain rivers. This is me speaking with Sri Bhupendra Yadavji a couple of years ago when he visited the Wildlife Institute of India. And I told him that it's very much essential to keep at least a few rivers in the headwaters of Himalaya undammed so that the species can return to their homing areas for breeding, migration, which happens seasonally. So we need to have at least some rivers protected rather than tapping the hydropower potential of all of them, because eventually what is happening is we are incurring a massive biodiversity loss for the species which have been there for millions of years, even before we came. I'll leave you with an interesting case study from my own study area. I would say when we leave an area undisturbed, nature does come to rescue. You remember these 3 basins I spoke to you about? Parvati, Tirthan, and the bottom one is Asiganga. And just to remind you, I told you about one thing, that Parvati has snow trout, the brown trout, and it's dammed. Tirthan has the snow trout, the native species, the invasive brown trout, and has no dam. And Asiganga is a control site, right? Well, it was not always a control site. When I started my study in 2013, I started my investigations believing that there would be brown trout here because there were papers published and records out there definitely speaking of the presence of brown trout. So biologists had known that the brown trout existed there, and it had always been there. It was also an invaded basin. So what happened that it was just the snow trout that was left in the area? As I said, nature does come to rescue. And August 3rd, 2012, there was a massive cloudburst and a disaster which definitely shook the area. But one thing was for sure, it wiped out bridges, buildings, but it also wiped off along with these buildings and bridges, the brown trout in the area. The topic is very interesting, and I would love to speak about it with anybody later on. And I would just give you a glimpse about it. The process I read about after my first year of investigations in the area, that why do we not have any more brown trout? I spoke with fishermen in the area and they said, yes, they haven't seen any brown trout in the area. In fact, my colleagues right now are in Asiganga and they're actually sampling the area again to ensure has the brown trout returned? But I haven't heard any good news. I would say it's a good news that brown trout is not there anymore. Still, it's not there. And the reason being the flash flood extirpated the brown trout. And why does it happen? It is a phenomena deeply rooted in the natural history, the basic biology and the basic natural history concepts called the priority effects. And what is a priority effect? Nature always prefers species which have been there in the region since forever or longer. So the species which came in first would be preferred by the nature as compared to the species which came in later. And why does that happen? Is because a species which comes first gets more time to establish itself, gets to know the area better, and thereby nature prioritized the snow trout. I read about it and I realized I'm still waiting for scientific investigations which I can do in the future about how turbidity influences the snow trout and gives it cues already to migrate to the tributaries. So as soon as you have a flash flood, the turbidity increases in the region. And there's certain amount of turbidity gradient. The initial higher levels of turbidity give the snow trout a sense to migrate into the tributaries, which the brown trout cannot yet sense because it's new to the area. And a legacy of invasion was wiped out in one night. And to link it with the spiritual angle, Mother Nature definitely safeguards, because if we conserve the nature and let this area be free of any dams, there was no dam in the entire river here. And thereby it was easy to wipe out the brown trout. Had there been a dam, there would have been a protection for the species not to be wiped off. So if left undisturbed, the nature definitely comes back to its original form. So yes, priority effects did extirpate the non-native brown trout just in one night. And scientifically speaking, native species can revive if we do not have external stressors like invasive species or damming pressures, because we cannot control the climate change for sure in an area. We have to do that globally. But locally, we can definitely speak about dams and invasive species removal. Under invasion, we know that headwaters are critical invasion refugia, and there are policy decisions which are suggested. Like we can catch the brown trout and not release it back, but harvest it. This is one of the ways to typically remove the invasive species from the area. And we definitely need to bring in people into the approach. So there has to be a shift in focus also on the rivers from the landscape to a riverscape approach. Like the Wildlife Protection Act has many species listed in there, but very few freshwater species. And we need to bring in more focus on riverscapes and also the social scape. How are the people related to the rivers, both in terms of their indigenous knowledge and in terms of their reverence for the rivers? And definitely we need more connectivity pathways. All in all, India's sentiments of animism and nature worship hold its people and biodiversity thriving in coexistence and living in harmony, the main thing which we are speaking of in this conference. And the people's resilience is definitely cornerstone to conservation in our country, as the example I gave about a tiger allowed 3 man-kills before anything happens to it. And economic development in a country cannot stop, but it needs to go hand in hand with the conservation. And people are doing their bit already. And so do I believe the government does if we as scientists speak out for these species. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma, for this wonderful talk. Now the floor is open for discussion. If anybody has any question, please ask or write in the chat box. We already have an appreciation from Asutosh Bharma. Nice title of the paper.
Oh yeah, I read that. Thank you so much.
Another one. Please ask any questions if you have.
Yeah, feel free to ask any questions. And you do not need to stick to the topic. You can talk about anything. You can talk about West and East comparisons.
Actually, I have that question in my mind. What about Eastern Himalaya? Is there any
in terms of
like that?
in terms of can you come to the question again? In terms of
dams and their effects.
Oh, the dams and their effects. As far as I understand, there is no cohesive study which can build in a comparison as yet in terms of the influence of the biodiversity. There are EIA assessments happening every now and then, but a comprehensive study in terms of the impacts of dams on the downstream and upstream biota, I think there is a very big lacuna that needs to be filled in. And there are many topics which can be worked upon. It can be really interesting to do that.
Okay. Okay, if there is no question, then thank you, Dr. Aashna, for this wonderful talk. I know it is
Thank you so much.
there, so please have a night.
Yeah, I think we have a question, Tapujit sir. And the question is, does priority effect work on native flora as well? Oh, that's an interesting question. Can you tell us any case study you know? The priority effects actually is a phenomena which prefers species, as I told you, which have been there in the area and have co-evolved and adapted to the region. Now, if you talk about native species and species which are maybe endemic to the region, they have always been there. They have evolved with the area. You cannot date them in terms of which one came in first and which one came in second. One might have evolved into being a different species over time, but they have been part of the system forever. So you cannot say that the species has come in later. Whosoever comes in later in terms of the biological phenomena are always the non-native species. So you cannot have the priority effect working on the native flora. Be it flora or fauna, no. Wiping out in terms of flora, I am not pretty sure of a study that has happened. I did discuss this concept with the salmon ecologists here in the US, and there has been just one case study, surprisingly, on the wiping out of one of the non-native species, which was the rainbow trout, and that was in the southern states of United States. The topic was not very it did not come into limelight that much, but there is a paper published on the scientists reporting this in quite much detail. So yes, it is very common if you want to observe that in fresh waters, but that happens only after a disastrous event like a natural calamity. Does it happen for the native flora is a really, really interesting question. I would say people do need to study that. That is it happened or not? It's an interesting case study. Maybe before and after in a natural disaster area, we can definitely compare the invasive plants. So yes. Yeah, pleasure.
Okay, any more? It seems no.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you again, Dr. Aashna,